Settle in, friend. Let the day fold itself away like a letter tucked back into its envelope, the edges softened from being read too many times. Dim the light beside you. Draw the blanket a little higher. Tonight we are going to travel, but only in the way that stories let us travel, quietly, with our shoes off, through a door that opens in the mind and closes gently behind us. Imagine, if you would, an evening somewhere in the middle of the last century. The sky is the color of an old photograph, that particular blue-gray that lives between dusk and memory. A single lamp glows in a farmhouse window. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls the hour, and the sound travels so slowly across the fields that by the time it reaches us, it feels less like a bell and more like a lullaby. The war, which had been thundering across the world for years, has grown tired in this hour, as all loud things must. And in the pause it leaves behind, a stranger kind of story begins to stir. This is the story of the Ghost Army. It is not a story of great marching columns, though there will be marching in it. It is not a story of roaring cannon, though you will hear a faraway echo of guns. It is, instead, a story of illusions, of paintbrushes and loudspeakers, of rubber tanks softer than beach balls, of young men, artists, actors, radio operators, set designers, architects of make-believe, who were asked to fight a war not with steel, but with suggestion. They were asked, in essence, to dream on purpose, to dream so loudly and so convincingly that the enemy, many miles away, would dream right along with them, and in doing so, look the wrong way at just the right moment. It is a true story. That is perhaps the most astonishing thing of all. Every gentle absurdity you are about to hear actually happened in actual fields, under actual stars. Somewhere tonight, beneath the grass of old European meadows, there are still traces of their footsteps. And above those fields, the same sky still turns, quietly as it did then. But before we begin, let us give ourselves a moment. Stories like this one, the soft ones, the slow ones, the ones that lean in close and speak almost in a whisper, they ask a little patience of us. They ask us to let go of the hurry we have carried all day, to loosen our grip on the things we cannot fix tonight, to trust for a little while that the world will turn along just fine without us tending to it. So let the day fall away. Let your shoulders drop a half inch. Let your breath find its own soft rhythm, the way breath does when we finally stop minding it. If your mind wanders off somewhere, to a stray worry, a kitchen light left on, a message not yet answered, that is perfectly all right. Let the wandering happen, and when you notice, simply return to the sound of this voice, as a boat returns to a quiet dock on a calm lake. The Ghost Army was small, just over 1,000 souls, a number you could fit into a country inn, more or less, if the inn were very large and the guests were very polite. They carried almost no conventional weapons. Their trucks were light, their tanks were hollow, their broadcasts were pretend, and yet, again and again, entire divisions of the enemy turned toward where they were not, and away from where the real danger lay. They saved, by the best accounts, tens of thousands of lives. They did it without a single battlefield charge. They did it, you might say, by painting the air. Think of that for a moment. 1,000 quiet young people walking softly through the dark, carrying cans of paint and reels of recorded sound, armed with nothing more dangerous than imagination and careful timing. But they did not wake up. They simply did the work, took down their props and went home, and kept the secret for nearly half a century. Tonight, over the course of our little journey, we are going to meet some of them. We are going to stand beside their inflatable tanks in the morning mist. We are going to listen, with soldierly attention, to the phonograph songs of pretend armies rolling through sleepy French villages. We are going to wander into quiet fields where illusion and courage grew side by side, like two kinds of wildflower. For now, though, there is no rush. The fire is lit. The kettle, somewhere, is warm. And our story, gentle as a falling leaf, is only just beginning. Let us travel then, softly as mist, across the wide Atlantic, across the rolling hills of Virginia, into the spring of 1944. In those days, was a city that hummed. Not with sirens or shouting, but with a low and constant murmur. The sound of a nation thinking, a nation working, a nation quietly bending every hour toward a single distant shore. The cherry blossoms had come and gone, drifting down like pink snow along the tidal basin. The Potomac ran slow and silver. Streetcars clanged gently down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the evening light, golden as honey poured from a jar, settled upon the limestone walls of a great five-sided building that had opened just 2 years before. The Pentagon. A vast, hushed hive of a place, whose corridors, laid end to end, would stretch for more than 17 miles. Inside, deep within that labyrinth of polished linoleum and frosted glass, our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. A small office, on a quiet floor, with a brass number on the door. A single desk lamp, casting a warm pool of amber light. A map of Europe, pinned to the wall, its edges curling softly at the corners. And around a long oak table, a handful of men, sleeves rolled to the elbow, collars loosened, eyes bright with the strange and patient fire of people dreaming something new. Picture them, if you will. The tobacco smoke rising in slow blue ribbons toward the ceiling. A coffee pot, forgotten on a hot plate in the corner, sighing gently to itself. Papers everywhere. Diagrams, sketches, cables from London, photographs of desert battles fought the year before. And through the tall window, the lights of the Capitol coming on one by one, like stars deciding, at last, to appear. These men were not generals in the thunderous sense. They were planners, thinkers, quiet, curious souls who had spent their evenings reading about Sun Tzu and about Hannibal, about the wooden horse that once rolled into Troy. They had studied the old British tricksters of the North African campaign, those clever magicians who had fooled Rommel's eyes in the shimmering desert heat with plywood tanks and painted lorries. And slowly, gently, an idea had begun to form among them. An idea as soft and as strange as a feather falling into a still pond. What if, they wondered, a whole unit could be built, not to fight, but to pretend? What if an army could be made of rubber and canvas and clever sound? What if you could paint a threat into existence, inflate a regiment overnight, broadcast a division through loudspeakers strapped to the hoods of jeeps, What if deception itself could be given a uniform, a shoulder patch, a proper place in the order of battle? It was, by any measure, a peculiar notion. The sort of notion that made cautious colonels chuckle and reach for their pipes. And yet, here in this quiet room, on these soft spring evenings, the idea would not go away. It lingered like the scent of lilacs through an open window. It settled into the creases of the blueprints and the margins of the memos. One of them, a thoughtful officer named Ralph Ingersoll, had seen the British conjurers at work overseas. He had watched them turn empty fields into phantom armies with nothing more than paint and persuasion, and he had come home carrying the wonder of it in his coat pocket like a smooth, small stone. Beside him, Colonel Billy Harris listened and nodded, and sketched in careful pencil the bones of a unit that did not yet exist. An outfit that would, they imagined, contain artists, radio men, sound engineers, stage designers, men who knew how to make something seem, gently, to be something else. And so, by the low hum of the ceiling fan and the soft tick of the wall clock, the plan took its first shy breaths. Memos were typed on heavy paper. Proposals were folded into envelopes and slid across desks. Generals read them and frowned, then read them again, and slowly began to smile. On the 20th day of January 1944, a single sheet of paper was signed. A unit was authorized. Its official name, as dull and sensible as a gray woolen sock, would be the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But in time, in whispered legend and in the memory of those who served, it would come to be called by a far lovelier name. A name that drifted like wood smoke through the quiet halls of history. The Ghost Army. And so it is to that name we now return, dear listener, and to the curious question of who, exactly, made up this ghostly company. For when you imagine an army, you might picture rows of tall, stern-jawed soldiers, their boots polished to a mirror, their rifles held with the easy familiarity of men who had grown up hunting in the hills. You might picture farm boys from Nebraska, dock workers from Baltimore, mechanics from Detroit with grease still under their nails. You would not, perhaps, picture a young man with charcoal smudges on his fingers, his pockets stuffed with sketchbooks, humming a bit of Gershwin as he walked. And yet, that was precisely the sort of soul the Ghost Army came searching for. The recruiters went looking, not in the usual places, but in the places where light fell differently. They wandered through the corridors of art schools, where the smell of linseed oil hung in the air like a quiet memory. They peered into the studios of advertising firms on Madison Avenue, where copywriters daydreamed at their typewriters and illustrators sharpened pencils with long, careful strokes. They knocked on the doors of architecture departments, where plans for buildings that had not yet been imagined were pinned to drafting tables under soft lamps. They visited theaters and workshops and the back rooms of radio stations, where men in cardigans tinkered with reels of tape and coils of wire. From these gentle corners of American life, the Army gathered its strangest harvest. There was the painter, slight and soft-spoken, who had never held anything heavier than a camel hair brush, now being fitted for a helmet that felt absurd on his narrow head. There was the fashion designer, who had spent his afternoons draping bolts of silk over tailors' forms, now being handed a canvas satchel and a pair of scratchy olive wool trousers. There was the sound engineer, accustomed to the hush of recording booths and the click of well-made microphones, now told he would one day record the roar of phantom armies. There were architects whose eyes had always searched for the golden proportions of a window, now asked to imagine how a fake tank should cast its fake shadow in the late afternoon sun. Among them walked young men whose names, in the quiet years that followed the war, would come to hang above gallery doors and grace the spines of thick, cloth-bound books. Bill Blass, who would one day dress the finest women in America, folded his long frame into a bunk bed in a drafty barracks. Ellsworth Kelly, whose paintings of simple, luminous color would one day fill museums from Paris to New York, lay awake listening to the whistle of the wind against the rafters. Art Kane, who would photograph jazz legends on a sunlit Harlem stoop, carried a rifle across parade grounds, blinking into the dawn light. There is a kind of gentle absurdity in picturing them there, isn't there? Men with slender, clever hands, men who knew the names of 20 shades of blue, men who could sketch a perfect oak leaf in the time it took to draw a breath, all lined up in wobbling rows, learning how to salute. Some fumbled with the buttons of their uniforms. Some looked longingly through the windows of the mess hall at the far-off trees, the way they were leaning, the way the shadows pooled beneath them. And yet the army had chosen them with great care. For the generals had understood something simple and profound. To fool an empire, one does not need only brute strength. One needs imagination. One needs the kind of mind that can see what is not there, and then, with a few clever strokes, make others see it too. One needs painters who understand how a shadow can suggest a shape. One needs designers who know how the fall of fabric can transform a man. One needs architects who know that a good illusion, like a good building, must stand up to light from every angle. One needs engineers of sound who understand that the ear, trusting creature that it is, will believe what it hears even when the eye grows suspicious. So the art school graduates drilled and marched and polished their boots, and at night, under the low amber glow of barracks lamps, they passed sketchbooks back and forth and drew each other's faces in pencil. They spoke, quietly, of Matisse and Rothko. They folded letters home into neat little squares. They slept, wrapped in wool blankets, dreaming not of battles, but of colors, and of the strange, beautiful task that lay ahead of them. And somewhere far away, across an ocean that shone like hammered silver in the moonlight, the war waited, patient as a stone, for these gentle conjurers to come. Now, across that same silvered ocean, in a quiet corner of the American countryside, there stood a cluster of long, low workshops where the strangest kind of magic was being born. The lights inside burned late into the night, warm and amber behind their dusted windows, and from their open doors drifted the soft, steady music of creation. The purr of sewing machines, the low whisper of air pumps, the patient tapping of careful hands at careful work. Here, in these unassuming buildings, men and women in rolled-up shirt sleeves were making an army out of rubber. Not a real army, of course. Not one that could fire a single shot or crush a single stone beneath its treads. But an army that could be seen and photographed and reported on and feared. An army, you might say, made entirely of belief. They began with drawings. Long sheets of paper spread across wooden tables, weighted down with coffee cups and spools of thread. On those sheets, engineers sketched the shape of a Sherman tank, the way a poet might sketch the shape of a dream. Every turret, every hatch, every road wheel drawn in loving, painstaking detail. They measured the real tanks down to the last rivet, and then they asked themselves a gentle, almost mischievous question. How little of a tank, they wondered, did you really need in order for a tank to seem to be there? The answer, it turned out, was very little indeed. A skin, a shape, a shadow in the right place at the right hour. And so the sewing began. Great panels of rubberized fabric, olive green and canvas brown, were stitched together by women who had, until recently, been making raincoats and inner tubes and inflatable life rafts for sailors. Their needles moved in long, patient lines, the way a grandmother's needle moves across a quilt. Seam by seam, a flat sheet of rubber became a curve, and a curve became a cannon, and a cannon became the nose of a tank that had never known a forge. When the last stitch was tied off, they rolled the limp creature up and carried it out into the yard, where a man with an air compressor and a kind, weathered face was waiting. He would fit the nozzle to a small brass valve, and then he would turn the switch, and the whole workshop would pause to listen. There is something wonderfully peaceful about the sound of an inflating army. A long, slow exhale, as though the earth itself were breathing out. The flat green puddle on the grass would shiver and shift and slowly, slowly lift itself up. First the belly, then the hull, then the turret, rising like a sleepy animal lifting its head from a long nap. Within minutes, where there had been nothing but a tarp, there stood a Sherman tank, 30 tons of terror, weighing in truth about as much as a large wicker basket. 4 men could carry it. 2 men could lift it. A strong breeze, if they weren't careful, could carry it gently across a field like a leaf. They made jeeps, too, and trucks, and howitzers with long rubber barrels that pointed sternly at imaginary skies. They made spotter planes that could be pegged into a meadow and mistaken from 1,000 feet up for the real thing. They even made tents and oil drums and command posts, a whole inflatable world folded up and waiting in wooden crates, ready to be poured out onto any hillside the war required. And the remarkable thing, the truly wonderful thing, is how well it worked. Hardened generals, men who had studied tanks the way scholars study scripture, would peer through their binoculars at a ridge across the valley and count the armor gathering there. They would see the glint of paint in the morning sun, the long shadows in the afternoon, the slow, grumbling movement of iron giants. They would nod to their aides. They would make their plans. And all the while, the ridge held nothing but rubber and rope and the laughter of men hiding in a nearby hedgerow. It is a quiet kind of wisdom, this. The wisdom of knowing that what the eye sees is often only what the mind expects. That a war, for all its thunder and steel, is also fought in the soft, uncertain country of belief. And in those warm workshops far from the guns, the gentle conjurers went on, stitching and pumping and painting, turning simple breath into divisions, turning ordinary air into armies, as patient, as careful, as a mother tucking a blanket beneath her sleeping child's chin. And now, dear listener, let us travel south a little way, down through the soft green hills of Kentucky, to a place where another kind of magic was being prepared. A magic made not of rubber and paint, but of something even more delicate, of sound itself, and of the quiet patience of men who had learned to listen to the world. At Fort Knox, tucked away behind rows of oak trees and the slow murmur of summer cicadas, there stood a low brick building with small windows and a heavy door. Inside, the air was cool and still, scented faintly with warm metal and the resinous perfume of vacuum tubes. This was the studio of the sonic deceivers, and it was, in its own strange way, one of the most peaceful rooms in all the war. Imagine, if you will, the gentle clicks of the dials as an engineer turns them, each click no louder than a pebble dropping into a pond. Imagine the slow golden glow of the tubes, warming the darkness like candles set behind amber glass. Imagine the hush of a needle being lowered, the whisper of wires spooling from one reel to another, carrying upon its slender thread the captured voices of a war. For weeks these men had gone out into the fields with microphones as large as dinner plates, cradling them in their arms like sleeping cats. They had stood beside real tanks and listened. They had crouched in the grass and recorded the heavy, rolling grumble of Sherman engines grinding through the mud. They had caught the metallic sigh of hatches opening, the clink of mess kits, the soft laughter of soldiers around a midnight stove. They had gathered the footsteps of 1,000 boots marching through gravel, the creak of wagon axles, the faraway call of a bugle drifting through the mist. All of it, every tender little sound, had been pressed onto long black ribbons of magnetic wire, coiled onto great spools that turned slowly, slowly in the warm half-light of the studio. And here, in this quiet place, the true artistry began. For a battle does not sound like a single noise. It sounds like a symphony, each section entering in its own time, each instrument blending with the next. So the engineers worked with the care of orchestra conductors, layering one recording over another, moving a tank from the left ear to the right, letting footsteps fade into the hush of distance, allowing a truck to pass behind the trees and disappear like a dream. They would sit for hours at their consoles, adjusting a dial by a hair's breadth, leaning in to hear whether the echo was right, whether the distance sounded true. A young man, no older than a schoolteacher, might press his headphones close to his ears and smile softly, having at last caught the perfect fall of a boot upon wet earth. Another might lean back in his chair and close his eyes, imagining the battlefield that existed only in the turning of the reels before him. Outside, the Kentucky night would deepen. Fireflies would rise from the grass like little lanterns set adrift. Somewhere, a screen door would swing shut, and a mother would call her children in from the porch. But inside the studio, the slow hum of the tubes went on, and the wire whispered its secrets from reel to reel, and the men worked with the hushed attention of watchmakers setting the tiniest jewel. When at last a recording was ready, it would be carried out to the great sonic trucks, massive speakers mounted upon heavy frames, capable of sending sound rolling across 15 miles of open countryside. In the dark of some future night, across the fields of France, those trucks would play their captured symphony, and the enemy in their trenches would hear tanks that were not there, and troops that had never come, and bugles sounding the movements of ghosts. But tonight, here at Fort Knox, there was only the patient work of gathering, layering, listening. Only the glow of the tubes. Only the soft creak of a chair as someone leaned forward to check his watch. Only the low breath of the building itself, and the tender, unhurried turning of the reels. It is a lovely thought, isn't it? that some of the fiercest illusions of the war were stitched together in such quiet rooms, that a man with good ears and a careful hand could, by listening very closely, summon whole armies out of the darkness, that the thunder of war could be held for a moment in something as gentle as a spool of wire, no thicker than a strand of a grandmother's hair, glowing faintly in the amber light. And now, from those quiet rooms of wire and wax, we step outside, out into the salt wind, out to where the sea itself is waiting. Picture, if you will, the southern coast of England in the summer of 1944. The air smells of tar and diesel and damp canvas, and the harbors are crowded with ships as thick as lily pads on a pond. Somewhere among them, the men of the Ghost Army are boarding. They carry duffel bags stuffed with uniforms meant for other units, patches they have not truly earned, insignia borrowed like costumes from a theater trunk. Their trucks roll up the ramps of landing craft, and nestled inside those trucks, folded small and sleeping, are the inflatable tanks, great rubber beasts, deflated and patient, like dragons curled up for a long nap. The channel crossing is gray and gentle and strange. The men lean against railings and watch the English shore grow thin, then vanish. Some of them sketch in notebooks, a seagull, a fellow soldier dozing against a coil of rope, the pale, moving silver of the waves. Others listen to the hum of the engines and think of home. And somewhere below decks, the loudspeakers rest in their crates, quiet for now, dreaming of the thunderous voices they will soon be asked to wear. When they arrive, it is Normandy, bruised and beautiful and still smoking in places from the great storm of D-Day. The beaches have already been tamed, but only barely. The men step onto sand that has been raked by history, past the hulls of half-sunken ships, past signs warning of mines, past tangled drifts of wire like the bones of some enormous, sleeping animal. And then they move inland into the hedgerow country, the bocage, the French call it, where the fields are small and the lanes are sunken, and every green wall of brambles feels as old as a fairy tale. Oh, how the hedgerows welcome them. Tall walls of hawthorn and hazel, knotted with wild roses, shot through with the buzzing of honeybees. The roads are narrow and muddy, rutted by tanks and hooves and centuries of farm carts. Cows watch from their pastures with enormous, unhurried eyes. Apple orchards lean over stone walls, heavy with green fruit not yet ready to fall. And the sun, when it finds a gap in the clouds, paints everything the soft gold of an old photograph. Into this landscape, the Ghost Army sets up its first true stage. They choose a field, perhaps at the edge of a sleeping village, a field where the grass is high, and the daisies nod in the breeze. And there, under cover of a kind summer dusk, they begin to inflate their tanks. The great rubber shapes unfold and swell with a slow, patient breath, rising from the grass like mushrooms after a rain. Men in real tanker uniforms, borrowed of course, walk among them with calm importance, leaving careful footprints in the mud, smoking cigarettes for anyone who might be watching from the far hills. And the loudspeakers, those great wooden boxes of trickery, are carried to the tops of hedgerows and tucked among the bushes, pointed like flowers toward the German lines. When night falls, they begin to sing, not songs, but the song of an army. The deep grumble of tank engines, the clank of treads over stone, the shouted orders of officers who do not exist, the laughter of soldiers who are, in truth, only ghosts of sound, traveling on the soft air of Normandy, crossing fields where owls are hunting and where foxes pause, heads tilted, to listen. The villagers, in their shuttered cottages, hear it too. Old farmers who have lived through 2 wars now. Shepherds, wives who remember the last time soldiers passed this way. They do not always know what is real and what is not, and perhaps that is part of the magic. Perhaps for them, this strange traveling theater is simply another chapter in a very long story. Another set of young men passing through the lanes, leaving footprints in the mud, vanishing before the rooster crows. By morning, the ghost army is often gone. The inflatable tanks have been folded back into their trucks, like great sleeping swans tucked under a wing. Loudspeakers are silent again, carried away in their crates. Only tire tracks remain in the soft earth, and perhaps, here and there, a cigarette end, or a cluster of false insignia dropped, quite on purpose, for the enemy to find. And so the traveling theater moves on, deeper into the hedgerow country, carrying its quiet illusions from village to village, from field to field, through a summer that smells of hay and gun smoke and wild roses. A summer, it seems, made partly of mist and partly of dreams. By late summer, the illusion had learned to travel west, out of the hedgerow country and down into Brittany, where the air carried the salt of the Atlantic and the low, patient breathing of the sea. The roads narrowed here. The hedges softened into stone walls furred with moss, and the villages, with their gray slate roofs and whitewashed shutters, seemed to have been waiting quietly for centuries, content to watch armies come and go as one might watch the weather. It was toward the old port of Brest that the ghost army now turned its gentle, painted face. Brest, clinging to its harbor at the far edge of France, where the land remembers it is nearly finished and the ocean begins. And here, in the villages and crossroads leading to that stubborn, battered city, the deception became something closer to theater than to war. A long, slow rehearsal, performed in the open air, for an audience who must never know they were watching a play. The soldiers were no longer only soldiers. They were actors now, quiet and serious about their craft. In the blue hours of early morning, before the mist had lifted from the fields, they sat on ammunition crates with needle and thread, sewing new patches onto their sleeves. A shoulder flash from a division that was, at that very moment, far away on another front. An embroidered number, a colored bar, a small stitched lie, carefully attached with the patience of a grandmother mending a shirt. Each stitch was a line of dialogue. Each patch, a costume for the day's performance. They practiced their parts like players backstage. A sergeant would explain, in a voice low and almost kind, that today they belonged to a different outfit. Today, their trucks had come from a different town. Today, their general was a different man with different habits, and they were to speak of him as though they had known him for years. The men nodded, repeated the names, folded the new identities into their mouths, and walked out into the villages as someone else. In the cafes of Brittany, over small cups of bitter chicory coffee and glasses of cider the color of wheat, the performance unfolded. Soldiers leaned on zinc counters and spoke, loudly, just loudly enough, of plans that did not exist. They grumbled about a crossing that was never to happen, complained about a march that had never been ordered, boasted of a division whose only true territory was the imagination of its creators. and if a stranger lingered near the door, or a curious face turned toward them from a table by the window, why, all the better. That was the balcony seat. That was the gallery. That was the audience for whom the whole long, gentle farce was staged. The villages, without quite knowing it, had become the sets. A barn became a headquarters. A farmyard, with its geese and its leaning apple tree, became a motor pool. A dusty crossroads, marked with a hand-lettered sign in the wrong direction, became a signpost meant for eyes hundreds of miles away. Old women in black watched from their doorways and offered bread, kindly, to young men who were pretending to be older men, from other places, on other errands. And the old women, being wise, asked no questions, only smiled, and let the soldiers pass. Every movement was choreographed, though softly, as though the choreographer were a little sleepy. Trucks rumbled through a square at a leisurely hour, then circled back through side streets and rumbled through again, so that a watcher counting from a distant hill might believe he had seen a great column passing. Tents rose in one meadow at dusk and vanished by dawn, reappearing in another meadow as if carried there by the wind. Radios chattered in codes that meant nothing, only the rhythm of meaning, only the music of traffic, so that any listening ear would hear an army breathing steadily in its sleep. And through it all the men moved with an unhurried grace. They had learned by now that the smallest details mattered most. The bored cigarette held just so. The complaint about the rations, spoken at just the right volume. The easy joke about a commanding officer who had never existed, delivered with the warmth of long familiarity. It was acting of the kindest, most modest sort. No applause, no curtain call, only the quiet hope that somewhere, far beyond the hedgerows, an enemy map was being marked in the wrong color, and an enemy plan was being drawn against the shadow. So the long rehearsal went on, through golden afternoons and lavender evenings, while Brittany kept its ancient, patient counsel, and the sea, just out of sight, whispered along its cliffs. And then the seasons turned, as seasons always do in these old stories, and the long summer rehearsals gave way to autumn rains, and autumn to the cold, pale light of a European winter. The ghost army moved with the armies of liberation, through the liberated orchards of France, across borders drawn and redrawn by careful hands on careful maps, toward a river that had waited, patient and wide, since long before any of them were born. By the first mild weeks of spring in 1945, they had come to the banks of the Rhine. Imagine, if you will, that famous river in the softest hour of early morning. A low mist lies along the water, like a folded quilt, so thick in places that the far shore seems to have wandered off somewhere during the night. The current moves the way sleep moves, unhurried, dark, murmuring to itself. Willows lean down to touch their own reflections. Somewhere beyond the curve, a church bell counts out the hour, and the sound travels over the water the way small secrets travel between old friends. This, the planners had decided, would be the Ghost Army's greatest bluff. Upstream, the real crossing was being prepared, the true weight of men and steel that would carry the war across at last. But for that crossing to succeed, the enemy's gaze had to drift somewhere else, somewhere downstream, to a stretch of riverbank where nothing of consequence was happening at all. And so the deceivers were asked to do what they had quietly been learning to do for almost a year. They were asked to conjure 2 whole divisions out of river mist and rubber and radio waves. 2 divisions, roughly 30,000 imaginary soldiers, to be willed into seeming existence along a gentle bend in the Rhine. They began, as they always did, with the softest tools. Painters went out in the blue hour before dawn and unfolded wooden signs, setting them along the hedgerows and crossroads, division patches, unit names, careful little arrows pointing the way to headquarters that did not exist. They worked the way gardeners work, kneeling in the dew, placing each marker with small and thoughtful hands, as though tending early seedlings. Behind them came the inflatable fleet. Rubber tanks were unrolled from their canvas bundles and coaxed full of breath by quiet compressors, rising from the wet grass like strange gray mushrooms after a warm rain. Rubber trucks took shape beside them, and rubber guns and long, lovely rubber boats stacked near the water as if awaiting an assault that would never push off. Tracks were scored gently into the mud by men with rakes, 100 small gestures weaving the illusion of recent, heavy traffic. By breakfast, a whole pretend army had bloomed along the riverbank, quiet as a field of wildflowers. Then came the voices. The sound men set their great speakers in the orchards and along the dike roads, and as the sun climbed, the recordings began to play, not loudly, never loudly, only at that coaxing over-the-water volume that carries best at dawn. The clink of metal bridging sections being unloaded, the low grumble of engines idling on a gravel track, a distant friendly argument about where the coffee had got to, boots on planking, the splash of a pontoon being eased into the current, all of it drifting across the Rhine toward listening ears on the far bank, gathering, in those ears, into the unmistakable hush of a great army preparing to cross. And above it all, on the radio frequencies, the gentle theater of the airwaves. Operators who had studied real units the way actors study real people tapped out the familiar rhythms of those divisions, daily lives, supply requests, weather reports, a sergeant's mild complaint about the condition of a field kitchen, the tiny, ordinary chatter that only a living army would bother to make, the very texture of presence broadcast into the mist like a lullaby sung to an enemy mapmaker far away. For 2 long days and 2 long nights, the deceivers kept their careful river going. The painted signs stood in the rain. The rubber tanks held their patient breath. The speakers murmured their soft, persuasive rumor. And somewhere, we must hope, a tired officer in a faraway command post leaned over his map and drew a cautious circle around the wrong stretch of water, and moved a division there that might otherwise have been somewhere else entirely. Upstream, unseen, the real crossing gathered itself in the dark. And along the quiet bend that had never been anything but a stage, the river went on talking gently to its willows, carrying the whole gentle fiction away on its current, as though it had only ever been a dream the water had, once, on a misty spring morning long ago. And in time, even the river forgot. The war, too, began to fold itself quietly away. Spring gave itself over to summer, and summer to a long, astonished autumn in which the guns, one by one, went silent across the fields of Europe. Orders came down through tire channels. Men who had spent months pretending to behold the visions were told at last that they could stop pretending. They could put down the loudspeakers. They could let the rubber tanks sigh flat in their crates. They could go home. But before they went, a quiet officer gathered them together in a room that smelled of canvas and cigarettes and asked them to carry one last weight with them, all the way back across the ocean. He asked them never to speak of it. Not to their wives. Not to their fathers. Not to the neighbor leaning on the fence in the long blue evening. The deception had worked so well, you see, that the generals wished to keep it folded in tissue paper in case it might be needed again one day. And so the men nodded and signed their names and stepped out into a world that would know them only by a simpler story, that they had served, that they had come home, that they were lucky. They went home on ships that rocked slowly through the gray Atlantic. They stood at the rails in their olive coats, watching the coast of America rise out of the mist like something half-remembered from childhood. The harbor bells rang and the tugboats coughed, and somewhere a band was playing a song that sounded like every song that had ever been played to welcome soldiers home, all the way back to the beginning of welcomings. And then, one by one, the trains carried them inland. They stepped down onto small wooden platforms in towns you have never heard of. Towns with a single traffic light, and a barber pole, and a diner where the coffee was always on. Towns in Ohio and Vermont, and the long green middle of Pennsylvania. Their mothers met them with trembling hands. Their sweethearts met them with careful smiles. Their fathers simply nodded and took the duffel bag and carried it up the porch steps without saying anything at all, because some things fathers know without being told. And the men sat down at kitchen tables and ate meatloaf and drank milk from glasses that had been waiting for them on the shelf for 3 long years. And they did not speak of it. They went back to the lives they had left, as though picking up a book that had been turned face down on the arm of a chair. The painters returned to their easels, and the light through the studio window seemed exactly as it had been, waiting patiently, having moved only a little with the seasons. The designers returned to their drafting tables and sharpened their pencils and began again to draw the shapes of kettles and chairs and advertisements for shampoo. The art teachers returned to their classrooms and stood in front of rows of restless children and showed them how to mix a soft gray, how to make a shadow feel like a shadow, how to see. Some of them became very famous. Their paintings would hang in quiet museums and be studied by students who had no idea that the gentle old man who had made them had once, long ago, inflated a tank at midnight in the rain. Some of them became quietly beloved in their towns, the kind of men who were always called upon to paint the set for the high school play, or to design the float for the 4th of July parade. Some of them simply lived, raised children, raked leaves, grew tomatoes, grew old. And for nearly 50 years, the secret slept beside them. It slept in the drawer with the old photographs they had been permitted to keep, photographs that showed nothing particularly strange. Just young men leaning against jeeps, grinning, the way young men in every war have leaned and grinned. It slept under the floorboards of memory, stirring only sometimes, in the small hours, when the truck passed on the highway and sounded, for just one moment, like something much larger and much farther away. They grew gentle, these men. They grew gray. They held grandchildren on their laps and told them stories about trains and dogs and the cold winters of their own boyhoods. And when the grandchildren asked, as grandchildren always do, what they had done in the war, they would smile softly and look out the window at the long evening light and say only that they had helped. And then they would change the subject, gently, like folding a letter back into its envelope, For many years, that was how it stayed. A folded letter. A secret kept not out of fear, but out of something quieter. A kind of modesty, perhaps, or the simple sense that the war belonged to everyone who had fought it, and that their particular story, with its inflatables and its loudspeakers, its painted patches and its borrowed songs, was only one small thread in a very large tapestry. The files remained classified for decades. The canvas tanks deflated in warehouses and were forgotten. The speakers were unspooled, the scripts retired, the sketchbooks packed away in attics beneath Christmas ornaments and wedding dresses. And the men themselves grew older, as men do, becoming fathers, then grandfathers, then the soft white-haired figures at the ends of long dinner tables, who fall asleep in armchairs while the football game flickers on. But stories, even hidden ones, have a way of rising slowly to the surface, the way a leaf lifts from the bottom of a still pond and drifts at last into the light. In time, the papers were declassified. Historians came knocking, gently, with tape recorders and kind questions. A book was written. A documentary was filmed. Young people who had only ever known the Ghost Army as a rumor whispered at the edges of history began to understand what these quiet old men had done, how they had drawn the enemy's eye away from their brothers, how they had traded their own safety for the safety of others, not with rifles, but with rubber and brushstrokes and the careful choreography of sound. And then, in their twilight years, when many of them were well into their 90s, and some had already slipped softly into that good and gentle night, their country gave them the highest honor it knew how to give. The Congressional Gold Medal. A small round thing, heavy in the hand, engraved with the faces of men who had once painted insignias by lantern light and lugged speakers through the mud of unfamiliar villages. The surviving members gathered in a grand hall in the Capitol. They wore their best suits, the ones usually reserved for weddings and funerals. Their wives straightened their ties. Their daughters kissed their cheeks. And when the medals were placed into their hands, those old, trembling hands that had once held paintbrushes and cable reels, they looked at them for a long moment, as if trying to recognize something glimpsed far away, across a great many years. Some of them cried, softly. Some of them only smiled. One of them, it is said, turned to the man beside him and murmured, only loud enough for the two of them to hear, that he wished the others could have been there. The ones who hadn't made it home. The ones who had gone on ahead. The ones whose laughter still lived, somewhere, in the memory of a cold Belgian forest and the long green fields of a slow European spring. And perhaps that is the truest part of the story. That these men, who had spent their war pretending to be other men, who had borrowed the voices of entire divisions and worn the shoulders of regiments they did not belong to, in the end, asked only to be remembered alongside their friends. Not as heroes, not as legends, just as a group of young men who had done their best, with paint and canvas and sound, to come home and to bring as many others home with them as they could. It is a gentle kind of courage, imagination. It does not shout. It does not swing a sword. It sits quietly at a drafting table in a cold tent, sketching the outline of a tank that will never fire, listening to a recording of trucks that will never drive, humming softly to itself in the dark. And somehow, out of that quiet work, lives are saved. Whole futures are stitched back into place. Grandchildren are born who would not otherwise have been. So tonight, as you rest, and as the lamp grows low, And as the soft hush of the house settles around you like a familiar quilt, think, if you like, of those old men. Think of them in their gardens, in their armchairs, in their final peaceful afternoons. Think of the metals warming slowly in their hands, and the long, kind light falling across their shoulders. They made a world out of make-believe, and by doing so, they helped the real world go on. And now the fire is only embers, and the evening has folded its long wings, and there is nothing left to do, nothing at all, but to close your eyes and let the story carry you gently, gently into sleep. Good night.